Okay, thank you for that, Turretin. You will now have a cross-examination with Mr. Albrecht cross-examining Turretinfan. You have 3 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Okay. My contention is that Latria and Dulia are two distinct words. I'm aware that you also agree with such, but you place a qualifier that Dulia can never be used in a religious context towards mankind. If such is the case, can you please explain to me why Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 and 14 tells us to serve one another in love using the second person plural form of duo? I believe love being the chief religious context of the whole New Testament, that this simply doesn't get any more religious than this term being used in a religious context.
Well, yes, I think the answer is that the loving our neighbors as ourselves is fulfillment of the second table of the law. And the example that I gave in my last speech about the Good Samaritan would be an example of how someone could serve another person without it being in a religious context. Of course, if we make all of life, which should all be about obedience, if we should make all of life a religious context, it just means that the word religious has lost its sense.
I would agree with you, but it's clearly being used in a religious context in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 and 14. At least that's what I would contend. I would like to ask you another question. Your contention is also that the word proskuneo cannot be used in a religious context towards mankind because each time it is worship. Is that your contention?
Well, my contention with regard to proskuneo is that Jesus himself said that we should only serve God. So that's the basis for my contention.
Okay, excuse me.
But yes, I do understand that word has a broad semantic range. So for example, it can mean to stoop or to duck down and to bow before someone. So you do see people bowing before kings, for example. And in Acts 7:7, with which you're familiar, you see someone bowing before a centurion, to provide another example. So it's possible for people to do this without it being involved in a religious context.
Okay. Well, how would you interpret 1 Chronicles 29:20, which reads, "They bowed low and fell prostrate before the Lord and the King." Is not the third person plural form of proskuneo used here? And would you contend that that is not in a religious context?
Well, there were a lot of knots in there, but the word proskuneo is used, the appropriate form of the word as you described. But the interesting thing is that it's used equally of God and of the king. So the first question I would want to know is whether the God and the king there are two different people, or God is being described both as the Lord and as the king.
Okay, this ends our second cross-examination session. Mr. Albrecht, you'll now have a 4-minute affirmative rebuttal. You may begin when you're ready.
All right. I think what we find here is we find Turretinfan as well as anybody else that uses these arguments in a bit of a bind here because they've got to try and read away the plain reading of Scripture. I've used Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 to 14, which uses duo in a religious context. It shows us that we can serve one another in love, love being the chief religious context of the whole New Testament. It simply doesn't get any more religious than this. I would imagine love to be the most important biblical concept of the Bible. We read in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 to 40, that love is what encompasses the greatest commandments. In Romans 13, 9 to 10, love is the fulfillment of the whole law. So it's a theme that cannot be escaped. It doesn't get any more religious than this. Even Galatians chapter 5, verse 6 tells us that the only thing that matters is faith working through love. Moving on, I then post 1 Chronicles chapter 29:20 to Turretinfan, which indeed does use proskuneo here in a religious context. And what is most interesting about this passage is the clear evidence that the whole assembly falls to bow and worship God, but they also bow in reverence to the king. I'm not sure if Turretinfan actually read the passage. I'm sure he's read it before. Maybe didn't read it at this moment because he erroneously, I don't know if he asserted or was questioning whether the bowing down and the proskuneo was given to the Lord and the Lord was the king as well. Well, the fact of the matter is, the direct reading is in reference to the Lord and to the king. Therefore, the proskuneo here is used in a religious context towards a man. Moving forth, I would simply disagree with the lexicons and dictionaries that Turretin basically asserts that they do not use the distinction that I am speaking of, and I would suggest that he read those lexicons and dictionaries again, because they do speak about all of the different usages. So I would disagree with him there, and I would suggest that he read those that I mentioned. Turretin also argues distinction, which I have shown is not biblical because of the fact that Catholics kneel down before statues and light incense and candles. It is simply a caricature of the Catholic position to basically say that we have reduced all of these terms and the meanings to just kneeling down, lighting incense and candles. It simply is much more than that. And those words that he said were nearly exactly the words that I've heard from other people use. And it's an argument that is used over and over. The simple fact of the matter is, duo is used in a religious context towards mankind, and proskuneo is used in a religious context towards mankind as well. This is biblical. It can be shown in the Greek. And I believe that if Turretin cannot find a way to answer Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 to 14 away, or 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 20, and he's in a bit of a bind. There are indeed more passages that do use these terms, and I believe that I can find more passages that use these terms in a religious context. But I particularly, I'm holding myself to using these terms at this moment. And I think if he can't, I truly believe Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 to 14 is a clear religious context. Therefore, I believe the definitions that the Catholic Church gives these two terms are indeed biblical, and I believe that they are sound with the Christian faith.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Albrecht. Turretinfan, you now have 7 minutes for a rebuttal.
All right, I will now try to sum up this debate and explain why I continue to believe that religious adoration and religious veneration should be given to God only. Albrecht keeps seeming to try to push the burden on me to prove that scriptural point, which I've already made, that as Jesus had said, we should serve and worship God only. He seems to be pushing it back on me to show that there isn't a distinction. Of course, my position here is the negative. He is the affirmative, and the initial burden of putting forth a case for this distinction is on him. Now, if he wants to use scripture to prove his point, and he relied on a few scriptural verses in his last speech, then it's on him to show that those verses that he's relying on actually demonstrate the point he's trying to make. Let's address the contentions he made. First, the contention from Galatians. He states that something doesn't get any more religious than love. And that's interesting, but love should mark our whole life. I don't think Mr. Albrecht disagrees. And in fact, because love is the fulfillment of the law, and our whole life must be a life of obedience to God, this would mean that our whole life was religious context, and in short, that the qualification that it's a religious context is simply a meaningless qualification. But if Mr. Albrecht is saying that, then it becomes clear why he doesn't see the Reformed position here. The Reformed position is that the religious context has to do with, things like church. It's maybe a little hard to put our fingers on it if someone's trying to tell us that our whole life is the religious context. But I think that Mr. Albrecht sees the difference between what he does in church and what he does at his work, at his office. In any event, we can move on from that because his contention has just been very general. There's nothing in Galatians, the verse that he cited, that sets out Dulia in a religious context, it just sets out in the context of life. Moving on to the First Chronicles.